In the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there is an Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript catalogued as Bruce MS 74. It was brought to Europe in 1773 by the Scottish explorer James Bruce, who spent 3 years in Ethiopia and returned with 3 copies of a text that Western Christianity had not formally engaged with for over 1,000 years. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch came out of the caves, more copies than most books still in the Old Testament. What chapters 14 and 17 through 36 of 1st Enoch describe is not a vague, luminous cloud. It is a structured system, 7 distinct regions with 7 distinct populations. Physical properties measured and named, functions described in language scholars have characterized as unusually specific for ancient apocalyptic literature. The question is not whether the Church teaches heaven incorrectly. The question this documentary examines is more specific and more interesting. What did this text, preserved across 3 independent manuscript traditions for over 2,000 years, actually describe, and how does that description compare to what Western Christianity made dominant? This documentary examines what the text actually says, what mainstream scholarship has documented about it, and where the line sits between what the text contains and what various researchers have proposed it means. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The manuscript record. What is verified? The Qumran fragments designated 4Q201, 4Q204, and 4Q206, held at the Israel Antiquities Authority in Jerusalem, preserve Aramaic text from the relevant vision sections dated to approximately 100 BCE. The Greek Akhmim fragment, recovered in 1886 and held in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, preserves related material in Greek. The fullest descriptions exist in the Ethiopian Ge'ez tradition. Michael Knib of King's College London produced the critical Ge'ez edition for Oxford University Press in 1978, the standard academic reference. Ephraim Isaac's 1983 translation from the Ge'ez for the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha series is the most widely used English translation of the Ethiopian text. George Nicholsberg's 2001 Hermania commentary on 1st Enoch for Fortress Press is the definitive contemporary scholarly reference. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame has published extensively on Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Lauren Stukenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich has published detailed work on the Enochic corpus. These are all real scholars with verifiable published work. The structural observation this documentary returns to throughout, made in various forms by Knib, Nicholsberg, and Vanderkam in their published work, is that the heavenly vision sections of Enoch are unusually organized compared to other ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature. Where other texts describe heaven in terms of divine radiance and praise, Enoch describes it in terms of functional architecture, what each region contains, who inhabits it, what those inhabitants do, and what the physical properties of each region are. That observation is documented in mainstream Enoch scholarship. The vision structure, how Enoch enters. Chapter 14 is where the vision structure begins. Enoch describes being taken up in a dream vision. The Ge'ez uses a verb form that Nicholsberg, in his published commentary, characterizes as indicating a conscious traversal rather than passive transport. He is not simply moved, he moves. He observes sequential transitions between regions with distinct physical properties. The critical vocabulary in Chapter 14 has been analyzed in the published scholarly literature. The Ge'ez word for the first structure Enoch enters, translated by Isaac as a wall built of crystals, carries physical connotations distinct from the decorative language used in later Christian heavenly vision texts. Knib noted in his published commentary that the word is used elsewhere in the Ge'ez tradition for constructed stone or composite building material, not for spiritual metaphor. Margaret Barker, in her 2004 Temple Theology, proposed that the architectural language in Chapter 14 reflects the physical layout of the Jerusalem Temple, that the Enochic vision of heaven was structured as a cosmic amplification of the temple's physical organization. This is a documented, peer-reviewed scholarly argument. It places the Enochic architecture in a specific cultural and institutional context, not a speculative cosmic invention, but a deliberate cosmological mapping onto a known earthly structure. Whether Barker's proposed connection between the temple layout and the Enochic heaven is correct is debated within the relevant scholarship. It represents one serious mainstream scholarly attempt to account for the architectural specificity that everyone who works on these texts acknowledges. What the seven regions actually describe. The full seven-heaven structure is more explicit in the second Book of Enoch, a Slavonic text whose relationship to First Enoch is debated within scholarship, than in First Enoch itself, where the structure emerges from the sequential vision journey rather than from an explicit numbered enumeration. Both texts are referenced in discussions of Enochic cosmology, and this documentary notes the distinction. In First Enoch's vision account, moving from chapters 17 through 36, Enoch traverses a sequence of regions with distinct properties. What follows draws from the text as translated by Isaac and Knib, characterized as a proposed sequential reading rather than an unambiguous numbered map. The first region, associated with the outer boundary, is described in terms of extreme cold, darkness, and stone, a threshold of separation from the inhabited world. The text uses language of absolute barrier, not gradual transition. Nickelsburg notes in his published commentary that this region functions structurally as an entry protocol. Its harshness is not punishment, but delineation. The second region introduces what the Ge'ez describes as stored atmospheric elements, snow, frost, cloud, wind, housed in discrete chambers. The text uses the same word for these atmospheric storehouses as for administrative storage facilities in Sumerian-influenced Akkadian literature. Knib noted this vocabulary overlap in his published edition. Whether it indicates literary borrowing from Mesopotamian tradition or independent convergence is a scholarly question without consensus. The third region, in the sequential vision reading, involves what the text describes as fire and a boundary of flame beyond which the vision becomes more difficult to sustain. Isaac's 1983 translation renders this as a region between coldness and fire, which Nickelsburg in his commentary identifies as the most cosmologically unusual transition point in the entire vision sequence, a junction point whose properties he described as structurally significant within the text's overall architecture. The fourth region introduces what Enoch calls the Watchers stationed at their posts, beings assigned to specific locations performing specific observational functions. Nickelsburg's commentary distinguishes between these stationed beings and the courier messengers described elsewhere in the text. These are resident functionaries, not traveling envoys. This distinction is documented in his published scholarship and reflects the same resident versus courier distinction he identified in chapter 40. The fifth region, in the sequential reading, involves what the text describes as the movements of the great luminaries, the sun and moon described not as objects in space but as administered processes, each with accompanying companies of beings whose function is to govern the timing of their movements. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, provides a more detailed parallel treatment. Nickelsburg and Vanderkam have both published on the relationship between the vision sequence and the Astronomical Book, treating them as complementary rather than redundant. The sixth region in the sequential vision reading is associated with what the text calls the voices of judgment, a region from which what will happen is observed as it is computed, and where records of earthly events are maintained. Stuckenbrook noted in a 2016 analysis that this region functions within the text as a cosmological court of record, and that its positioning before the central throne room reflects a deliberate administrative logic. Records precede judgment, evidence is organized before verdict. The seventh region, the central throne room of chapter 14, is described in terms that scholars have consistently found to be the most formally elaborate passage in the entire Enochic corpus. The throne itself is described with physical characteristics: crystal, wheel, fire, the appearance of water. The being on the throne is described not by personal features but by emanation, what comes from him rather than what he looks like. His appearance, the text says, is beyond appearance. Nib noted in his 1978 edition that this negative description technique, defining the central figure by what cannot be said about him rather than by attributes, is found in early Jewish mystical literature and represents one of the oldest attested examples of the via negativa, the theological practice of defining God by negation rather than positive assertion. This is a documented observation in his published scholarly work. How this differs from later Western Christian heaven. George Nickelsburg's 2001 commentary addresses this comparison directly. He documented that the simplified singular destination heaven dominant in Western Christian popular theology is a post-4th century development that emerged partly through the canonical exclusion of texts like Enoch and partly through the theological synthesis of Augustine and Jerome, who both engaged with Enoch and found its spatial complexity theologically inconvenient. This is a documented scholarly argument in Nicolsburg's published work. He traced the movement from a structured multi-region cosmology, represented in Enoch, in the Pauline reference to the third heaven in 2 Corinthians 12, and in other Second Temple Jewish texts, to a simplified, undifferentiated destination that he characterized as a theological reduction rather than a discovery. Vanderkam, in his published work, noted that the Enochic cosmological framework remained more structurally present in Eastern Orthodox and Ethiopian Orthodox traditions than in Western Catholicism and subsequent Protestantism. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which preserved Enoch within its canon, maintained a more spatially differentiated cosmological framework in its liturgical and theological tradition. This is a real historical observation about divergent canonical trajectories. John Collins of Yale Divinity School, in The Apocalyptic Imagination, most recently updated in 2016, treated the Enochic vision sequence as representing the most developed cosmological geography in any Second Temple Jewish text, more organized, more sequentially specific, and more architecturally detailed than its genre contemporaries. This characterization is documented in his published work. Barker's argument that the seven-region structure encodes the temple's physical organization mapped onto the cosmos, if correct, would mean that the Enochic heaven is not a mystical invention but a systematic cosmological application of known Judahite institutional architecture. That argument has implications for how the exclusion of Enoch from the canon is understood, not just the removal of one text among many, but the suppression of a specific cosmological framework rooted in pre-exilic temple tradition. This is Barker's documented scholarly argument. It is contested within the field. It represents a serious academic position rather than fringe speculation. The textual consistency, what three manuscript traditions establish. The core of the vision sequence, the sequential traversal, the seven-region structure in the Slavonic parallel, the throne room description, the stationed watcher distinction, is consistent across the Aramaic Qumran fragments, the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts, and the Greek Akhmim fragment. This three-tradition consistency is acknowledged within mainstream Enoch scholarship as significant for establishing the stability of the core textual content. Where traditions diverge, in specific vocabulary choices, in the level of detail given to individual regions, in the precise rendering of certain architectural terms, the divergence is itself a documented area of textual scholarship. Knibb's 1978 edition and Isaac's 1983 edition handle these divergences differently, and the comparison of their choices is a published scholarly discussion. The consistency of the seven-heaven framework across traditions has been noted by Vanderkam in published work. The specific architectural vocabulary being more developed in the Ge'ez than in the Qumran Aramaic, a feature rather than a corruption, in his scholarly reading, is also documented. This suggests the detailed architectural content was present in the tradition and was transmitted faithfully rather than added by later scribes. What is established and what is not? What can be independently verified? Bruce MS 74 is a real manuscript at the Bodleian Library. The Qumran fragments are real and held at the Israel Antiquities Authority. The Akhmim Greek fragment is real and held in Cairo. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts are real. Knibb, Nicolsburg, Isaac, Vanderkam, Collins, Barker, and Stuckenbrook are all real scholars with verifiable published work. The vision sequence in chapters 14 and 17 through 36 is consistently preserved across manuscript traditions. Nicolsburg did characterize the 4th century canonical exclusion as involving a cosmological reduction. Barker did argue for the temple cosmology mapping in published scholarly work. Collins did characterize the Enochic vision sequence as the most developed cosmological geography in any Second Temple Jewish text. What has not been independently verified, any suppression narrative beyond the canonical exclusion itself, the claim that specific institutional figures targeted the seven-heaven structure for theological reasons beyond what is documented in Jerome's and Augustine's surviving writings. What this documentary does not endorse, any specific theological claim about what heaven actually is, any claim that the Enochic seven-region structure is literally accurate as a description of a real cosmological geography, any claim that Western Christianity's teaching about heaven is wrong in a way that this ancient text proves. What is worth holding on to? First Enoch's vision sequence is a genuine, authenticated, extensively preserved ancient text that describes a structured, architecturally specific cosmological geography meaningfully different from the simplified singular destination heaven that became dominant in Western Christian popular theology. That difference is documented in mainstream Enoch scholarship. It is worth knowing, not because it proves what heaven is, but because it shows what one influential ancient tradition believed about the structure of the cosmos, and because that tradition was actively removed from the textual landscape of Western Christianity in a way that scholars have documented and discussed. The text is available, the scholarship is published, the comparison between what Enoch describes and what Western Christianity made dominant is a real historical question with a real documented answer. What heaven actually is, if it exists, and what it contains, is not a question an ancient text, however carefully preserved, can settle for anyone.